Well, hello, everybody. Welcome from me to ICN Spotlight. ICN Spotlight is a new format that we, for the first time, try out here. It shall be a one-to-one, interview, or maybe more a dialogue among heads of agencies and who else we might receive in this format in the future. My name is Andreas Mundt. I'm the president of the Bundeskartellamt in Germany, in Bonn, and with me is Andrea Coscelli. Andrea is the chief executive of the Competition and Markets Authority. I guess you're chief since 2017, Andrea, but you've been longer with the CMA, so very experienced by driving agencies not only through change, but through everyday dangers that we see as heads of agency. Our topic today is, in 45 minutes, is leading an agency through change. I think for the time being, this is a hot topic for agencies around the whole world. I just need to say COVID-19, digitalization of both the agency itself, which changed their way of working, and digitalization of the economy with which we struggle as competition agencies from time to time. So, in fact, this is enough of change, but Andrea still has to climb on another mountain that is called Brexit. So who could be better today to have with us and speak on this topic? The CMA is used to change. In 2014, there was the merger between the Office of Fair Trading, the OFT, and the Competition Commission. So very much welcome, Andrea. I'm happy that we meet at least on the screen and virtually. It's good to see you and to have you with us. The structure of the webinar today is we have three topics, in fact. We cannot do this today without speaking a little bit about COVID-19. Of course, we cannot do this today without speaking about Brexit. And of course, we cannot do it without speaking about digitalization and how we deal with the digital economy. So let's quickly go to COVID-19, the first part. Andrea, a hard lockdown for weeks and months, hundreds of colleagues in home office, literally no one in your vast office spaces in Canary Wharf. You have an open office, open space. I think one infected would mean that the whole agency would partially be infected. At the same time, I think you have received over 100,000 complaints. I don't know if that figure is correct. The flow of merger continues. You have to assess cooperation. It sounds dramatic. So let's start by telling me, Andrea, is it as dramatic as it sounds?
Thanks, Andreas, and thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today. So on COVID, if we go back in time to early March, and interestingly, I was trying to organize a digital conference, and Andrea was one of the keynote speakers at the beginning of March. And I remember the weekend there when we were trying to decide whether to allow people to physically come in or not. And in the end, I was advised to do it just essentially with the speakers, without the audience, which I think with hindsight was the right call, because the audience would have been 150 to 200 extremely well-traveled competition lawyers and executives. So that was the beginning of what now feels like a fairly long stretch. For the CMA, when our government around mid-March decided to go into lockdown, we found ourselves in a good place, because we had moved a few months before to these new offices that Andreas is talking about. And as part of the move, we had decided to invest quite heavily on technology and on putting essentially all of the programs we used to work on the cloud, and to give to every single employee of the CMA a laptop and a smartphone. And obviously, we had no idea about a pandemic at that point in time, but we were just very lucky with the time, because that essentially allowed us, as soon as we got into lockdown, to have essentially all of us in a position to work quite effectively and efficiently. The first few weeks obviously were quite difficult, like for everyone else. We're trying to work out what we could do, what was just too difficult to do in that setup. And we decided to pause, for instance, a couple of antitrust cases to release some people to work on other matters. We also decided to, what Andreas was alluding to be quite consumer facing. So we set up a process on our website whereby individual consumers could just complain to us about problems. And the problems, as I think for a number of other agencies early on, were mainly linked to what we call sort of price gouging or very significant price increases for things like hand sanitizer or face masks, but also an increasing number of complaints coming our way about cancellations and lack of refunds or lack of timely refunds. So we set up a fairly large COVID task force by moving people from other parts of the office to this area. And essentially that task force became the hub to do both what in the end ended up being quite a lot of consumer protection work. So we have consumer protection powers alongside competition powers, so particularly in the area of refunds and cancellation, we ended up doing quite a lot of work. But also we work closely with our government, as I know Andreas and others have done, to think about exclusions, temporary exclusions from competition policy for essentially emergency situations, which in our case were mainly in the grocery retail sector, in the dairy sector, and with some forms of transport, where essentially we took the view that it was really important for the operators to coordinate their activities during this particular phase. So quite a lot of activity in the near term. At the same time, we felt it was really important to continue our work. So certainly on the merger side, we continued exactly with the same work plan. We have statutory timetables on mergers, and we're able to review all of the cases. I mean, obviously, intellectually, we had to spend quite a bit of time thinking about the impact of COVID-19 on mergers, whether we should take that into account in the near term, or to what extent things we're learning literally week by week about COVID will have an impact potentially on the long-term implications of some of these transactions. And again, I know this is something that a number of other agencies have done. So that basically lasted for the initial sort of 10 to 12 weeks period, which was the length of the lockdown in the UK, which went on until around May, June time. And then we were between then and almost Christmas time in a period of progressive opening and progressive closure. So we reopened our office in a COVID safe way, but we're never really able to bring back most of the people in the office because of the restrictions, and also the restrictions on public transport in London, which is where most of our colleagues are located. And then right now we are in essentially what is the third lockdown in the UK. So we had to close our office again. The UK is suffering a fairly significant peak in cases and deaths at the moment. So we are back to where we were sort of the first time around, with everyone working from home. Again, we are, I think, reasonably successful at doing what we were planning to do. One of the factors that has the most impact on us is the closure of schools, which is the case now in the UK. And again, means a number of colleagues have to juggle kind of homeschooling and caring responsibilities with their work.
On substance, Andrea, I think all of us, for the time being, have to deal with some mergers that are maybe more critical in times of COVID-19 than they would be in usual times. Some claim failing firm defenses. Some just claim that they might drive into bankruptcy after some time. Due to COVID-19. So how do you deal with these issues, with the issue of this special circumstance, and taking it into account when you assess a merger, and maybe even a critical merger where you have to act swiftly? Part one of my question. Second part, We over here in Germany, we have seen lots of corporations among companies, not mergers, just corporations on a temporary basis. We haven't been lenient on that, but we have been flexible, let's put it this way. So we took into account these unusual circumstances that we see for the time being. How did you deal with that, or how do you deal, one must say, with that in London at the CMA on substance with regard to mergers, with regard to corporations among companies? And last but not least, is your government trying to have a word in this? I mean, that is some, I guess, happening in some agencies around the world. So how's that? What's this like in London?
Yeah, so let me start sort of in reverse order. So no, our government is not really talking to us about merger control. I think they are very respectful of our independence. So it is very much for us to think what is the right solution at the moment. So on cooperation, I must say, we have probably been as lenient as you have, in the sense that what has come to us has been quite selective. So for us has been, as I said, grocery retailing, and there's been a sort of second phase right now, which was around the turn of the year, which is partially linked to Brexit as well. And I said dairy and some selective things in the transport industry. So in those cases, I think we're taking a fairly pragmatic view that clearly these are sectors that are critical to the economy, and they've been under pressure. And because these exemptions were time limited with sunset clauses in the main, we felt that the risk, in a sense, was manageable. Now, obviously, like you, I worry about executives spending quite a lot of time together coordinating things, because even after the exemptions end, the same people obviously will will know each other, and potentially find it a bit easier to have certain conversations that might or might not cross the line. On merger control, on the other hand, I think we have decided to take a different approach, which is that in many ways we see ourselves as the guardians of kind of a productive economy in the medium term. I mean, if you think about COVID, one of the concerns I have, and I think you have exactly the same concern, is that at the moment, because we're still in the middle of this medical emergency, governments in most rich countries have quite literally thrown quite a lot of money to support schemes to the economy, which again, I mean, in many ways seems to me the right approach to take. But that has, I think, masked just the sheer level of dislocation that our economies are gonna suffer in future. So we need essentially productive economies that grow. We need economies where tax revenues will increase over the next few years to repay the deficit and the debt that we have accumulated. And we know that monopolies or tight oligopolies are bad for growth, are bad for productivity, to some extent are bad for income distribution. So I think, and I think that's the view of the CMA, that we need to keep the bar high on concentration, particularly in industries with significant barriers to entry and expansion, where essentially we know that if you acquire positions of market power, you're going to keep those positions for a number of years to come. So we have decided to focus very much on the medium term. Now, the question then is, to what, obviously we are learning week by week what's happening with COVID, and some industries might be impaired to some extent about the medium term. Demand could be, could be lower for a number of years. So these are obviously all things we're taking into account, and on a case-by-case basis. In terms of our actual decisions so far, we haven't really moved away in any significant way from the approach we would have taken pre-COVID. A case that I would just want to mention very briefly, just to show the complexity of it, is a case where we're looking into an investment by Amazon into a company called Deliveroo, which is the market leader in the UK for food delivery, which obviously is an important sector in a number of countries. And when we were literally taking the decisions during our first lockdown, the evidence from the first few weeks of the lockdown was quite negative for the company, because most people didn't feel they probably was safe to order, to order food from restaurants. A number of restaurants, particularly in the UK, shut down during the first few weeks of the lockdown. And so the company, which, in common with a lot of these tech companies with growth stories, had accumulated very significant losses. And so a lot of the funding was predicated on a sort of growth trajectory and new funds coming in. The company made certain representations about their ability to progress. And in our initial decision, provisionally, we took the view that there was merit in that potentially there could be a clearance based essentially on a failing firm defense. And then as the evidence kept coming in during the lockdown, things really changed and their revenues increased quite significantly. And so in the end, we ended up clearing the acquisition about a more standard economic analysis rather than a failing firm defense. And literally a few weeks ago, Deliveroo has now announced that they're planning to file for an IPO in the UK. They got new funding, and the evaluation now is approximately around £7 billion. So literally in a space of less than a year, this is a company that was making representations to us about failing. And in the space of less than a year now, this is a very successful kind of European tech company with lots of investors and a very significant valuation at this point. So this might be an extreme case because obviously in this type of industries, the growth trajectories have a big impact on valuations. But I think it's a useful reminder that things can change quite quickly. And there's always a risk that as competition authorities essentially accommodate some of these stories, and then we're left with a very enduring market power, which unfortunately is the situation now in a number of digital markets.
I fully agree, Andrea, and I think this is not the time to be lenient. Although I'd be anxious to see how the debate also in the political environment is about to develop now, because in times of crisis, usually many policymakers do not rely too much on competition, but mainly on intervention. So we will see how we will get out of this crisis with our agencies. Andrea, the UK formally left the EU at the end of January 2020, entering into a transition period that lasted until the 31st of December 2020. And then the UK, it's as simple as that. The UK left the EU single markets and custom unit. So it's no longer subject to EU law. There is an EU-UK trade and cooperation agreement that has been agreed on the 24th of December, Christmas, literally, has been signed on the 30th of December and took effect on the 1st of January this year. So the CMA annual plan 2021 and 22 said that the CMA is taking its place as a global competition and consumer protection authority as it assumes no new responsibilities after the EU exit transition period. Andrea, how does one get prepared for that? And what does Brexit mean for the CMA? Maybe we start with the organizational issues. What does it mean for your work? What does it mean for your structure? What does it mean for hiring people? What did it mean for your budget? That must be quite an experience.
Yeah, so in many ways, I actually started the CEO job initially as an interim CEO, literally a few weeks after the referendum, so in July 2016, and then I was confirmed with a permanent position the July 2017, as you mentioned. So literally my whole tenure as a CEO has been in the shadows of Brexit. Yeah. The way we structure it internally, and I think to be fair, we had full support from our government, was to essentially estimate the increase in work and essentially to try to represent the kind of the ambition of the UK government to have us as a fairly relevant sort of global authority post-Brexit. So we went to government with some estimates which essentially said, we probably need an increase of around 50% in our budget across the piece. That was mainly driven by merger control and antitrust. Consumer protection doesn't really change. It was mainly done at the national level. And we have the markets regime, as you know, which again is a national tool. So the two areas that really changed were merger control and antitrust, including cartels. Now, on merger control, as you know, for historical reasons, the UK always put quite a lot of time and effort into merger control. That was partially the legacy I inherited of having the two agencies, as you mentioned, the Office of Fair Trading and the Competition Commission. The Competition Commission had many economists and from fairly early on decided that, it would be appropriate to do in-depth economic analysis on complicated mergers and spend quite a lot of time on it. And that meant that over the years, we occasionally ended up looking at big international mergers with the US agencies. So there were mergers, as I'm sure it's the same in Germany, where because of the way turnover is allocated in Europe, the particular companies had significant business in the UK, but not much in the rest of Europe. And so we had some experience of working quite successfully with the FTC and the DOJ on fairly large transactions. So the big question for us on merger control was literally to move from a world where you have a handful of transactions every year that are international in nature to a portfolio that becomes much more international. So we asked for extra resources. We had the extra resources very early on. And again, as you remember, no one expected the kind of Brexit process to take, 3.5 years. The expectation early on was that in the space of a year and a half, things will be sorted out and we'll get on. So what in the end benefited us was that the increases in our budget came quite quickly. And so we had a couple of years where we had the money and the people, so we could scale up and expand without quite having the cases. And that has been the situation in sort of 2018, 2019, and 2020. So right now is the first time where we literally have some international mergers in pre-notification right now in parallel with the US agencies and the European Commission for the first time. So merger control, we always felt we wanted to invest in. The question there is, again, very similar to a number of agencies outside Europe, like, I would imagine Canada, Australia, Brazil, Japan. Agencies were essentially, what they're trying to do is exactly what we're trying to do now, which is to work with other partners, trying to add value, trying to make sure that the decisions are in the right place for their consumers and citizens. On the antitrust side, again, we're doing a similar process. As you know, a lot of the big digital cases have been done by the European Commission over the last 5 to 10 years. Even if occasionally we have done sizable cases like you have. So for instance, we did a case together on Amazon Marketplace a few years ago. We're doing some fairly large pharma cases, which are in many ways not different from the kind of European Commission's cases. So again, I think we feel reasonably confident that on individual cases, we kind of have direct experience of doing them in the right way and the way we will do the cases now. It's just the scale of now having a portfolio where there are many of these large, more complex cases at the same time. So organizationally, basically, we've expanded the individual areas. I mean, the CMA is set up as a matrix organization. So we have individual divisions responsible for particular areas. So we have, a mergers team, we have an antitrust team, but also we have a very large number of colleagues in horizontal kind of professional teams. So we have a large team of economists, we have a large team of legal advisors who essentially we embed on individual cases, but they work across all tools. And in a sense, we have scaled up our data team in a very similar way. So that has made it a bit easier because essentially our 50% increase in budget has meant a scaling up of the existing functions, which has been essentially accomplished by the end of last year. So now we have the people that we think we need. The other thing which is helping us is that the two main agreements in the end between the European Commission and the UK government, the withdrawal agreement and then the trade and cooperation agreement you were referring to, have pretty sensible provisions about the sort of step-by-step transition on the antitrust and mergers cases. So The merger cases, if they were not notified before the end of December last year, they are now with us, and everything that was notified in the fall is staying in Brussels, and the European Commission will take decisions for the UK as well. So that means in practice that over the next few months, we still have a mix of cases that we're doing directly and a mix of cases where the European Commission is finishing them off for us. And on antitrust, the rule is a bit less clear cut, but again, it's linked to the stage the case has reached in Brussels, and also whether the Commission might decide in future to scope out the UK or not. But for instance, if you look at some of the, the Amazon statement of objections that were announced a few weeks ago, the UK market is part of it, and the European Commission at the moment is going to finish those cases for the UK as well. So that in practice has really helped us, because it's almost like, we think by the end of this year, by the end of this calendar year, we'll have a portfolio which is much more international than what we have now. But it's really happening kind of month by month, rather than a big bang on the 1st of January, which would have been more difficult to handle.
Andrea, both of us have always been quite engaged in international cooperation. And when I meet you these days virtually, I still have to get used to the fact that I cannot tell you everything that I could tell you a couple of months ago, maybe. So I think that is of high interest for many in their daily work, in fact. On which basis and how will you cooperate in the future? Of course, with countries abroad, but mainly also with the European Commission. But what interests me personally, of course, with the member states. The EU-UK Trade and Cooperations Agreement, in fact, I find it doesn't say very much about competition and cooperation. There could have been more. In fact, it just says information exchange is permitted to the extent by the law of the jurisdiction concerned. Well, I mean, both of us know we had an extreme active cooperation among us as members of the European Union in the framework of the ECN for antitrust, but also within the framework of the mergers ECN. I mean, if it goes beyond that, we all know it gets less. So how are you going to manage this in the future? Because I can assume there will be cases that might have some parallels in London, in Bonn, in Paris, and of course in Brussels. So how are we going to?
Yeah, so this, I mean, in many ways, I'm in the same place. So we, in the early days of Brexit, I think there was a hope for us that a number of these things, particularly the cooperation agreements, could be done and signed by the time we left the EU, so that essentially there would be no discontinuity. Obviously, because of the way the negotiations have gone, we are where we are, with essentially a statement that I think both sides recognize it's in mutual interest to have a more enhanced level of cooperation than we have currently. So I am, cautiously optimistic that this is one of the areas where essentially we went down in terms of cooperation, because that's clearly the situation now, but it is in both sides' interest to kind of try to go back up closer to what we had before the end of December. That applies both to the Commission and to the member states. Unfortunately, in practice, these things take time and are complicated, and COVID is not helping in terms of bandwidth, because there are so many demands on our government. So my understanding is that the UK government is very keen to sign enhanced cooperation agreements during this calendar year and engage with the member states and the Commission. As you can imagine, we are fully supportive of it, but it is really in the hands of our government. In the meantime, we are doing everything we can within the current parameters. I mean, as you know, historically, the CMA has been a very active member of multilateral initiatives. Obviously, like ICN, which we've always been very strongly supportive of, the OECD, and the ECN was clearly a very important environment for us. Obviously, we cannot be part of ECN now. We're unlikely to ever be part of ECN again, but certainly anything we can do in terms of cooperation, we'll try to do.
I hope we can at least meet you, invite you to our ECA meeting that we have once or twice a year, beyond COVID-19, of course.
Yeah.
Also invite Switzerland to that, so I don't see a reason why we shouldn't. Andrea, I think one field of cooperation, of course, is our efforts with regard to the digital economy. And here, I think we really see a Europe, maybe even a world in transition, because everywhere something is happening. We see that US is taking up action with regard to the tech giants. We see the DMA at the European level. So we see the amended competition law over here in Europe. In Germany, you know, we have a new provision, Article 19A in our law, which allows us to declare a company of significance for competition across markets. We can prohibit certain behavior to this company, certain conduct. So we are also going in a somewhat more regulative direction here in Germany, but still deeply rooted in competition law, I guess. So if you look at the DMA at the European level, of which, of course, you are no longer part, but I think it influences also what might happen in the UK and what kind of cases one does. At least it influences us, of course. So what do you think? How will this go on in the UK? And will there be more room for cooperation in this field, cooperation among the UK, among the CMA and national competition authorities in Europe, and maybe also the European Union? But maybe we start with the question, what is the track now for the UK? And when will new provisions be in place? And what are you going to do until then? Just do nothing and wait until instruments are at hand? Or are you going to pursue these companies on the basis of traditional competition law?
Yeah, so we published this advice to our government just before Christmas, and we're very clear that we think we need sort of ex-ante regulatory framework, and we need to have more effective tools to deal with this company. So in many ways, what we have been saying in spirit, I think, is very similar to what some of the work you have been doing in Germany and the DMA. Some of the specific provisions maybe that we recommend are slightly closer probably to your legislation than to the DMA. So it is now up to our government to decide what to do next. What they have done when we published the advice was essentially to say, we like the idea, we want to legislate, and in the meantime, we're quite keen to give you some extra funding to set up this regulatory unit within the CMA in shadow form, which is what's happening now. So we have the funding to set up this regulatory unit from the 1st of April. And exactly as you say, what we expect the unit to do is two things. One is to keep working with government to legislate and to support the legislation. The other is really to use our existing powers to the full extent possible, because it's going to take some time for this legislation to be in place, and the issues are clearly there. So we launched a couple of weeks ago an antitrust case, for instance, against Google, linked to some of the privacy sandbox considerations, which have to do with some of the planned evolutions with Chrome, where we have received a number of complaints. So that's something that ideally, with the new regulatory powers, we would have probably done using our regulatory powers, but we are using the sort of antitrust powers at the moment. So it's very much a twin track. So we're going to use our resources with our existing powers. At the same time, we're going to keep our focus on the better powers. Our idea is very much to try to designate a number of companies, set up a code of conduct, binding code of conduct with proper statutory powers behind it, and then to have pro-competitive regulatory interventions in specific areas. So we will keep working closely with, certainly with the European Commission, with the Americans, with you, with everyone who is making progress in this area. And I'm pretty sure it will influence the final form of the rules and the regulations in the UK. I mean, in many ways, it's an early test of Brexit, to what extent, when we are discussing these measures in Parliament, to what extent, the UK government will feel that it's appropriate to potentially diverge from the rules coming in for the EU27. At some level, I think we all agree that trying to have convergence and similar rules works well. At the same time, obviously, the UK Parliament might decide that in some areas, different rules are better or more appropriate. So in many ways, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, we're certainly expecting to be an important player in that discussion in terms of our advice to our government and Parliament.
Andrea, I do believe we need new mechanisms of cooperation in Europe with regard to these companies, maybe also with regard to other companies that are active across markets. Because, of course, we have to answer many questions now with regard to the Digital Markets Act. A lot of things, from my perspective, are not very clear yet as far as the ICN is concerned. What is the relationship between the DMA and 101, 102 applied by the European Union? What is the relationship between the DMA and the activities of national competition agencies, be it based on competition law 101, 102, or on national provisions like the 19A that we have over here in Germany? But be it as it is, don't we need to make sure in a way that we do not have countervailing cases and maybe in the end even remedies that go in different directions in Europe, maybe at the national level, at the European level, or then in London, in the UK. So do you think we need more or even a closer mechanism for cooperation in this respect in order to avoid remedies that go in different directions?
Yeah, so I think we absolutely should try to do that. And obviously, I mean, you're playing a major role in it, but I think we are all trying to coordinate. And as you say, it's the first time, we are pretty good now at doing global mergers and cooperating globally on mergers, but it's the first time that we're all trying to use our own legal instrument essentially to deal with similar issues. So I think we have made some progress. There are lots of good conversations going on. And in many ways, we all deal with similar issues. And even if our legal tools and processes are somehow different, I think we're all trying to do broadly the same thing. I mean, in many ways, I think it's also important to bear in mind that when the companies complain about a number of different regulatory initiatives on what are essentially similar practices, I mean, the reality is if the companies change their business models globally in some of these areas, all of these cases will go away. So, at the end of the day, it's a choice for companies to decide, how many parallel regulatory and competition inquiries they want to have on the same practices. You and I know they could fix them by changing some of these things. So, I mean, I personally think, this is going to go on. I think we're in a much better place as regulators than 2 or 3 years ago, because I think there is a much clearer understanding that just ex post competition law and merger control are not sufficient, that we have reached a stage with at least some companies in some areas where we need more. And in many ways, for me, if you think about financial services or pharmaceuticals, these are relevant benchmarks of industries where there's a lot of regulation about lots of other things. And we as competition authorities come in and do, various bits and pieces. But parts of the tech sector are just under-regulated, and some of the concerns that come to us as competition authorities are things that ideally should be fixed by regulation or by legislation. So my hope is that over time, more of this happens, and we can slowly go back to a world where, we play our role as competition authorities, and then either us or someone else is playing a role as a regulator in the specific areas. And in many ways, the technology, the business models, the individual companies, this keeps changing. There are entire areas where, as competition authorities, if you think about Internet of Things and 5G and AI, there are lots of things happening in those markets, but the reality is as competition authorities, we're not massively focused on those. While if you are a regulator, if you're a regulator for financial services, you are constantly doing horizon scanning, you're constantly thinking about the impact the new technologies will have. So I think there needs to be a bit more of that in the digital space, and that can be done either by us or by a regulator. I just think, at the moment, just there isn't enough control over some of these business practices.
Personally, I find it difficult to regulate these companies. I still, and this is why I very much like the German approach, because it's so deeply rooted in competition law. That we still do a case-by-case decision, which kind of company we have before our eyes, and what shall be the obligation of that specific company, the specific obligation, by the way. So, and it must be flexible and not backward-looking, so it must be open to.
And that's exactly our approach. That's exactly the spirit of our current advice to government in the UK.
Andrea, one last question. We're running out of time already. This is a very short format, in fact. Just one very last question. We have this talk here in the framework of the ICN. Can we do more in the ICN, in the OECD, and other international fora? Can we do more to coordinate in this respect? Do we need to do more? Do we have the right formats for that?
I think so. I think, as you know, I've always liked the ICN, and I think the flexibility of the tools and the various events, I think, works well. So absolutely. I think we should constantly think about doing more in the context of ICN and OECD. Personally, I'm also quite open to, individual agencies working with others and going ahead in certain areas, certain direction. The problem, obviously, with very large international organization is just the risk of dilution when you try to have too many people, because obviously individual situations and concerns and pressures differ. But I certainly think, ICN, OECD, and obviously the ECN are very, very important fora to make progress. And certainly, the consequence of Brexit for us is that our portfolio is increasingly international, and so our ability to work well with others is increasingly critical to our ability to deliver for UK consumers. And I think that's the situation for many other agencies worldwide as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrea, many thanks for that. It was great to get some insights in where the CMA is moving and how you drive your agency through change. Thank you very much. Many thanks to our audience. Many thanks to our audience. We will continue with this if you like it. So we will be happy to receive just some feedback on that, what we can do better, maybe shorter, longer guests, whatever. So many thanks for joining us today, wherever you are in the world. For some of you, it's early in the morning. For some of you, it's already late at night. So, Andrea, to you, many, many thanks. Stay safe and stay healthy, and hope to see you soon in person. And until then, virtually is very much appreciated. So,
great. Thanks a lot.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.